I've had a few encounters of late with normies. Some I know and one I didn't. And as usual, they have caused me to question my positions, which I suppose is the value of such encounters. Such is their value that I should welcome more of them. But like all of us, I still don't relish the thought of being branded a deluded conspiracy theorist. I should be immune to such accusations by now. Conspiracy theory, as an insult, is as debased as the slur racist, so liberally has it been thrown around for the last 3 years. You'd have thought it had lost all of its power, but somehow it still stings. And it brings to mind that approach that so-called professional pick-up artists insist that their students employ, the shotgun tactic of asking 50 women in one day for their telephone numbers. Of course, as is obvious, the goal is not to add 50 new numbers for your little black book, but merely to embrace and therefore get over the fear of rejection. She said no. It was painful. But so what? Did it kill you? Did it even hurt you? No, not physically at least. And that's the worst that can happen. I've never done such a thing, much less been persuaded and cajoled into it by someone else, but I do believe that there is value in it. And from the perspective of a 55-year-old man who's never had to do such a thing, I think all young men should be at least strongly encouraged to do it. And my hypocrisy doesn't stop there. I think everybody should ride a motorcycle for 2 years before being allowed a car, despite never having had a bike licence myself. I think all children in their early teenage years should be dispatched off to a foreign-speaking country for at least 6 months in order to learn a language when their minds are at their most capable of easily absorbing one, despite only managing schoolboy French myself and never having insisted my girls do the same. But doing difficult and even dangerous things at an early age probably is the best way to cope with all the other difficult things in life that life will throw at you in adulthood. I always think of that English boy who sailed around the world at the age of 16 and communicated with his parents on Christmas Day when he was thousands of miles from anywhere in the distant Southern Ocean. I've no way of knowing, but I'd be willing to bet that that boy will never be afraid of anything in his life ever again. The same probably goes for men who've witnessed combat, although again, I wouldn't know. But my lack of immersion in the bear pit of debate where you are in a minority of one is something to be embraced, and one that I'm hoping to correct when I restart my stall in my local town. YouTube is one thing where you can refine your arguments. Twitter is quite another. But the cut and thrust of debate in the moment is the way, not necessarily to avoid difficult challenges, but to not allow them to knock you off balance, or worse, shut you up. In order to change people's minds, we have to be presented with a mind that needs changing, and we won't find that out unless we expose ourselves to the challenge and even to the ridicule of others. But back to my encounters. The first was with a lifelong friend, and it was very short and sweet. We were discussing general things and drifted into climate, and I said that I'd read, despite the scare stories, the Earth hadn't heated up for 15 years. His response was merely that he'd heard the complete opposite, and then we both sat there and thought, I wonder who's right. But this was the least fractious of the 3 encounters. The second was with someone who was the new boyfriend of one of Mrs. X's long-time friends. This was a chap I'd only met once, but he seemed nice enough. He was a little older than me and a touch hippyish, with some floppy hair and a Don Quixote goatee beard. So if you'd had to guess, on the basis of so little information, you'd think he'd at least tend towards what you might term the alternative view of the world. Now, as we know, the alternative view, which in the past would have meant being anti-establishment, is not nearly as straightforward as it might have been. The rebels of the entertainment world, for instance, like Sean Penn and the foul-mouthed band Rage Against the Machine, have become nothing more than shills for pushing the establishment narrative. So I wasn't expecting us to agree on everything, but neither was I expecting to agree on nothing. He didn't seem like a complete mainstream news swallowing normie, so I was anticipating some overlap in the Venn diagram. I was expecting to agree on some things and not on others. You know, how things used to be. But we got talking whilst the women were out of the room, and we touched upon the royal family, the nature of monarchy, and the validity or not of the institution. In fact, on this anodyne subject, we didn't actually disagree on much. But then, since the subject was seemingly unimportant to either of us, it mattered little. By this stage, we were still essentially engaged in small talk. But then I steered the conversation to American politics, and the chasm opened up immediately. We didn't talk for long because the women came back in, and so the subject was changed. But in that very short time, it was probably only 2 minutes, and certainly no more than 3, it was obvious we weren't about to agree on anything substantial. Not a single thing. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was met with an immediate rebuttal. The Hunter Biden laptop story was a conspiracy theory, but Russian collusion in the election of Trump was a definite. The dodgy count in Arizona was a fantasy, but the Democrats questioning the outcome of the 2016 election was valid. The various hearings validating the 2020 election was proof that nothing underhand had gone on, but the 6 years attempting to find evidence and finding no case to answer absolutely was not proof that Trump was innocent. Surely, I said, you're not saying that it's only the right that lie. I don't recall his response, but at one stage he rubbished the very idea of the deep state. You see, this was the part of the Venn diagram that I thought we both inhabit, no matter what else we might not see eye to eye on. The part where you acknowledge that politicians of all stripes cheat and lie. That was where I thought we'd agree, but he was having none of it. And not only was he quite vociferous about it, he was aware of the counter-narrative in his rebuttal of the idea of the deep state, and he seemed very sure of his ground. It seemed, in much the same way as Sam Harris, that he was saying it's okay when we do it. Although, to be fair, he never said that, but what he implied was that the left didn't lie. The topic of partisan American politics was enough of a hot-button topic, and we never got on to the subject of COVID, lockdowns, masking or vaccinations, and I was wondering what he might have made of those issues. Of course, I could have been pleasantly surprised, but the key thing here is that I would have been surprised. It's possible that he might view the entire COVID debacle in a completely neutral and, dare I say it, scientific way. He might have, but considering the relish in which he refuted my queries, I doubt it. But maybe I'm being uncharitable here, because I was beginning to form an opinion about him. I was beginning to think, I don't like this person. And this bothers me, because I don't like to think of myself as someone who might dislike someone because of their political views. And it is, of course, at least as likely that he was forming an equally uncharitable opinion of me. I don't know that, of course, but it seems likely. And if that is the case, and it really is just an issue of partisanship, we are in a fair amount of trouble, particularly if we want to change their minds. Because it isn't just a question of presenting some facts, as perhaps we would see it, and therefore, by the power of logic, leaving them with no option but to change their minds. It's a question of changing their allegiances, and that is far more difficult. Loyalties run deep, since they are usually forged over time, and to change them, particularly when they are changed quickly, leads to accusations of treachery. And nobody likes that. We on this side of the aisle are fond of branding those against us as traitors, particularly when it came to Brexit. Not that in some cases it wasn't justified. But there always were a great many Remainers who believed, and still do, that Britain's long-term future will be better inside the EU than outside it. I don't happen to agree with them, but they would see it as being more concerned about this country than being concerned about the European Union. The trouble was that there always was a very large Remainer element that really did hate this country and everything and everybody within it. And they really were traitors and thoroughly deserved that particular label. And in a way, I actually feel sorry for the Remainers that felt they had to line up with such people because they were tainted with that. But sometimes one must choose a side, and they chose the wrong one, even if it might have been for the best of reasons. But Brexit was a binary choice. The nature of such things is that it has to be that way. Either that or you don't offer an opinion at all, which of course means that you are necessarily still making a choice. That choice being that you will abide by the decision of the majority. Although having said that, anybody who embarks on a democratic as opposed to a majoritarian process should abide by that principle anyway, something that many Remainers have not. But as many of us have pointed out, this battle is not at all a battle between the right and the left, nor is it between the rich and the poor, blacks and whites, or even between trans rights and women's rights. This battle is between our government and us. And it's curious that so many people, the great majority in fact, have aligned themselves with the government and against us. So bearing that in mind, perhaps it is more correct to say that the battle is between the compliant and the non-compliant. The compliant do not see themselves as compliant, of course. In a very crude way, they see themselves as good, and those of us who do not comply as bad. Either bad in terms of virtue, or mostly bad in terms of intelligence. Freedomers who listen only to conspiracy theories rather than the settled science. The science. People who are too stupid to be listened to, and who then can be safely and legitimately ignored. Certainly those were the vibes coming off this bloke, that given the chance I was to be dismissed and ridiculed and then ignored. But this wasn't a friend or even somebody I knew a little. It would make little difference to him to demonise me or me him. But the last of my recent encounters was with a very good friend, almost a lifelong friend, and one I've spoken of before. We were at a mutual friend's house having something to eat, and he was grumbling, as he often does, about the prospect of Trump getting away with it. I always suppose that he means the January the 6th insurrection, since he describes that as the only time in America's history when there hasn't been a peaceful transfer of power. And when he puts it like that, it's hard to disagree that it was a serious business. But rather than confronting his Trump derangement syndrome head on, which just irritates him, I instead gave him an example of someone that I believe is worse, and by an order of magnitude worse. And that person is, of course, Justin Trudeau. Trump may be an arsehole, but he never froze anybody's bank accounts. To his credit, he acknowledged that that was an awful thing to do, but it doesn't dent his hatred for Trump, even a little. But having established that I also have a monster to despise, we could then move on to other things. And as the wind was in my sails, I also offered up Anthony Fauci as another guilty man disguised as something of a hero. This was something that I suspected and then had confirmed by reading Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci. My friend then said he had read a review debunking the central tenets of the book, thereby casting doubts on its veracity. But this was something I couldn't counter, and it led me back to this conundrum that we, as a society, must resolve. How are we to move forward if we cannot agree on even the simplest things? In this case, I was being encouraged to believe that Fauci was a hero, but due to the damaging effects on society caused by his influence and his recommendations, I looked around for evidence to back up my suspicions. In RFK Jr.'s book, I found it. Now, I fully appreciate that I was not necessarily following the scientific method, but merely reinforcing my own prejudices. But in my defence, I was looking for something that was counter to the consensus, and anything counter to a prevailing consensus is valuable, and is valuable even if it's wrong. And then somebody comes and tells me that the book is wrong. And I suppose by extension that Fauci is the hero they were telling us he was. To his credit, my friend wasn't saying that the debunking review was right, but that it raised questions over the credibility of Kennedy's book. So does that mean that I'm right, or is he? And there is also the issue of whether the one with the most information is more likely to be right. One might tend towards that view. I actually read the book from cover to cover and ingested 450 pages of information that was supported by 2,127 notes, references and citations. He just read a book review. What was that? 10 paragraphs? The consensus would have to be with me, wouldn't it? But then, of course, it may just be that I have just gone 450 pages deep down the wrong rabbit hole. Doesn't this just make me, in this very narrow sense, the expert? Does this make the well-read, the experts, the most trustworthy? Perhaps, but then perhaps not. If we transpose this to the issue of climate change, and we agree with this position, we must accept that all the professors, PhDs and those with doctorates are the ones who must be listened to and their recommendations and policies accepted, and that our own positions, supported by our limited school-time knowledge, must be disregarded. For instance, like all children of my age, I was taught that carbon dioxide was what trees and plants gobbled up, and it resulted in them producing oxygen. I don't ever recall carbon dioxide being referred to as a wonder gas or anything like that during those tedious biology lessons, but it was certainly never regarded as a danger to humanity. And that was only 40 years ago. Did they not know then what they now know as a certainty, that carbon dioxide would kill us all? If not, why not? If, like me, you're not any kind of scientist, you may, again like me, feel as if your puny knowledge of biology and botany is no match for the endless number of climate scientists that are forever on our airwaves. You probably feel that you are no match for them, and that the best thing you can do is to avoid showing your ignorance and just shut the hell up. What's that current diktat? Stay in your lane. As we all know, that just means keep your gob shut. But that basic fact that we learned in school is pretty fundamental. Is it no longer true, even this age of people being born in the wrong body and 57 genders? I'd be surprised if the science had changed that much. And if it really is simplistic, as they will tell us, why did they bother to teach it to us?
The truth is, I suspect, is that they taught us that because it was a basic truth, a truth that can arm us in our understanding of the natural world, as in not one that is easily blunted by grandiose and grandstanding eco-professors pushing their anti-human agenda.
So as we emerge, blinking out of our COVID silos, into a world we believed had finally come to understand what we all knew over 2 years ago, that lockdowns did more harm than good, that asymptomatic transmission was an obvious lie, that masking was for social compliance rather than stopping the spread, that the injections are neither safe nor effective, that the media lies to us always, that avoiding liability whilst coming very close to mandating their products was an almost perfect business model for Big Pharma, rather than anything at all to do with public health, and that everything, the media, the NHS, science, schools, universities, the courts, the police and government are absolutely as corrupt as they possibly could be without collapsing. We would do well to realise that the insane spasm that began in March of 2020, although not what it was, still has a grip on the majority of the population. But things have changed. The COVID cult is just that, a cult, but it's also a religion, and most crucially of all, it's an institution. And like every other institution we have, it is irredeemably corrupt. Everything that supported it is rotten to the core. It has taken many decades, even generations, for institutions to reach this level of corruption. But the COVID institution is not even 3 years old, and already it is a husk. Almost everything about it has been revealed to be a lie, but still it stands. And if we don't do what is required, the husk will be reused as a Trojan horse to engineer the controlled society in on the excuse of climate change. But talking to the normies is what will bring it down. And we have to have these conversations, even as some of them become even more vociferous in their clinging to the safe and effective mantra and the hysterical accusations of conspiracy theorists. They'll get more vicious the more they realise the jig is up. We should expect this and fortify ourselves. We must arm ourselves with our principles: freedom of speech, the rule of law, informed consent, bodily autonomy, the freedom to roam, the right to privacy, and a few basic truths. There are only two genders. Men can't get pregnant. A country must have borders. We are not racist, and carbon dioxide greens the planet rather than kills us. And the other thing we must do is to find some things we agree on. Find some common ground. There must be some. 3 years ago, we all agreed that forcing a medical procedure on someone was wrong. It's not so long ago. It's not long enough to have been forgotten. We remember it, and so must they, even if they pretend not to. Help them to remember that they weren't always like this. They want to remember, even as they want to forget what they did and what they supported. They will want to get back on the right side. Help them to get back to the people they thought they used to be. And then they will be.